It's 1991. Two hikers are walking through the Alps on the border between Austria and Italy when they spot something sticking out of the melting ice. At first they think it's trash. Maybe a doll. Maybe a hiker who got lost a few seasons ago. It is not trash. It is a man. A real one. Frozen, preserved, and completely intact for over 5,000 years. They call him otzi. And when scientists finally got him into a lab and started examining his skin, they found the answer to a question nobody had been able to answer before. When did humans start tattooing? Tattoos. 61 of them. Lines and crosses, mostly on his lower back, his knees, his ankles. Places that, if you know anything about acupuncture, correspond almost exactly to pressure points used to treat joint pain and arthritis. This man had ink on his body 5,300 years ago, which means the answer to when did tattooing start just got pushed back further than almost anyone expected. And he wasn't decorating himself for fun. He was, as far as anyone can tell, treating his own chronic pain with permanent marks on his skin. Stop and think about that for a second. We assume tattooing is a relatively recent human habit, a rebellious thing, a get one on a beach in Thailand at 22 and regret it by 30 thing. But the oldest tattooed human being ever discovered wasn't getting a tramp stamp. He was running prehistoric physical therapy on himself with a needle. Over 5,000 years before anyone had ever heard the word tattoo. So when did this actually start? Is otzi really the beginning? Or just the oldest piece of evidence we happen to get lucky enough to find? The answer is way older, way weirder, and honestly way more impressive than anything happening in a tattoo parlor today. Let's talk about what a tattoo actually is, because the mechanics matter here. A tattoo is permanent pigment inserted under the outer layer of skin, deep enough that your immune system can't just flush it out, but not so deep that it kills the tissue. Getting this balance right without modern needles, without sterilization, without any understanding of infection or immune response, is genuinely difficult. You need a sharp point. You need pigment that won't poison you. You need to go deep enough for permanence, but not so deep you bleed out or get an infection that kills you in a world with no antibiotics. In other words, tattooing isn't a casual accident. Nobody stumbles into giving themselves a permanent mark under their skin. Somebody had to figure this out on purpose. Somebody had to experiment. And probably, somebody had to get a few very nasty infections along the way before anyone got it right. So if otzi already had a refined, working tattoo technique 5,300 years ago, that technique didn't appear out of nowhere. Someone, somewhere, started long before him. Before otzi, the evidence gets murkier, but it doesn't disappear. Archaeologists working in Africa have found bone and ivory artifacts dating back over 40,000 years that show wear patterns consistent with tattooing tools. Sharpened bone points with pigment residue still embedded in microscopic grooves. We can't prove with total certainty these were used on skin specifically, because skin, unlike bone, does not survive 40,000 years. It rots. It decomposes. It becomes part of the soil within a few decades unless something extraordinary happens, like, say, getting trapped in a glacier in the Alps. This is the fundamental problem with figuring out exactly when tattooing started, and it's worth understanding because it reframes everything. Skin is fragile. Ink fades into nothing once the body breaks down. Unless a body is mummified naturally through extreme cold, extreme dryness, or unusual chemistry in the burial environment, any tattoos that person had simply vanish from the historical record. Forever. Completely undetectable. Which means every tattooed mummy we've ever found represents an enormous stroke of preservation luck, not the full picture, and definitely not the true starting point. Otzi just happened to die in exactly the right spot, at exactly the right altitude, to get flash frozen instead of decomposed. For every otzi we found, there are almost certainly thousands of tattooed ancient humans whose skin simply didn't survive to tell us when they started. So the honest answer to when did tattooing start is we don't actually know the true beginning. And we may never know with certainty, because the evidence required to prove it has a built-in expiration date measured in decades, not millennia. What we do know is that Otzi is nowhere near the beginning. He's just the oldest beginning we've managed to catch. And once you start looking at the timeline this way, the picture gets even stranger. Because Otzi isn't alone. Not even close. In Egypt, mummies dating back over 4,000 years have been found with tattoos. For a long time, archaeologists assumed these belonged exclusively to women, specifically dancers, or, depending on which outdated 19th century academic you ask, women of low social status. This assumption went mostly unchallenged for decades because, frankly, a lot of early archaeology was conducted by people with some very confident and very wrong opinions about gender and status in the ancient world. Then in 2018, researchers re-examined a male Egyptian mummy from around 1200 BC using infrared imaging, a technique that can reveal faded ink invisible to the naked eye. They found tattoos on a man. Symbols associated with protection and divine power, placed on his arms and torso in locations that would have been visible to others. The old assumption collapsed almost instantly. The tattoos weren't a female-only practice. They weren't a low-status marker. They were spiritual technology, applied to whoever needed that specific kind of protection, regardless of gender. And critically, this gives us another independent starting point for tattooing, one that has nothing to do with Otzi or the Alps at all. This pattern, tattoos as protection, as spiritual armor, as a direct line to something bigger than yourself, shows up again and again across completely unconnected ancient cultures that had zero contact with each other. In Siberia, Scythian mummies dating back around 2,500 years have been found covered in elaborate tattoos depicting animals, mythical creatures, and intricate patterns spiraling across entire limbs. These weren't simple dots and lines like Otzi's therapeutic marks. These were detailed, artistic, clearly the product of skilled specialists who had spent years perfecting the technique, which means this particular tradition had been quietly developing and refining itself for generations before anyone preserved it in ice for us to find. One particularly famous specimen, known as the Siberian ice princess, was found with tattoos so well preserved that researchers could study the exact technique used, stitching pigment under the skin with a needle and thread rather than puncturing it directly. In the Pacific, Polynesian cultures developed tattooing into one of the most sophisticated and culturally central art forms in human history, completely independently of anything happening in Europe, Egypt, or Siberia. The word tattoo itself comes from the Polynesian word tatau, which mimics the sound of the traditional tapping tool striking the skin. In Polynesian cultures, a person's tattoos, called tatau in Samoa or moko among the Maori, weren't decoration in the way we think of it today. They were a permanent, unforgeable record of identity, lineage, achievement, and social rank. You couldn't lie about who you were. It was inked into your skin for everyone to read, forever. This is the part that should genuinely blow your mind. 3 completely separate ancient cultures, with no contact, no shared history, separated by entire oceans and thousands of miles, all independently arrived at the same starting point. Permanently marking the human body carries meaning that temporary decoration simply cannot replicate. Tattooing wasn't invented once. It was invented over and over again by different people in different places who all landed on the exact same answer without ever comparing notes. Why would 3 unconnected groups of ancient humans all start doing the exact same thing? Because permanence is the entire point. Anyone can put on a necklace and take it off. Anyone can paint their face for a ceremony and wash it away the next morning. A tattoo cannot be removed, cannot be faked, cannot be borrowed. In a world without photographs, without written records, without any reliable way to verify a stranger's claims about who they were or what they'd done, a tattoo was unforgeable proof. It said this happened to me, or I did this, or I belong to this group, in a way that could never be talked back, never be denied, never be lost. Think about how much of modern life runs on exactly this same principle, just with different technology. We use IDs, certificates, diplomas, wedding rings, all permanent or semi-permanent markers that prove something about our identity or history that words alone can't guarantee. Ancient humans figured out the exact same problem and solved it with a needle and some soot, long before anyone thought to write anything down. Let's talk about pain for a second, because this matters more than people realize. Getting a tattoo with ancient tools was not a quick, clean, modern parlor experience. There was no numbing cream. There was no sterile single-use needle. Depending on the culture, the process could take hours, sometimes spread across multiple sessions over days or weeks, using tools made of bone, obsidian, or sharpened wood, with pigment made from ash, charcoal, or crushed minerals mixed with substances like animal fat or plant sap to help it bond to the skin. This means getting tattooed in the ancient world was, by necessity, an endurance event. And that fact alone tells you something crucial about why people kept doing it generation after generation. If something is genuinely painful, takes hours, and carries real risk of infection in a world with no antibiotics, people don't do it casually. They do it because the meaning attached to the result outweighs the suffering required to get there. In many cultures, this wasn't a bug in the system. It was the entire point. Among the Maori, receiving a moko was a deeply significant rite of passage, often tied to coming of age, status, or major life events. The pain itself was part of the ritual, a demonstration of endurance, commitment, and seriousness. You weren't just getting marked. You were proving something to your community through the act of enduring the marking. This connects to something we touched on with the campfire psychology of ancient humans. Shared difficult experiences create bonds that casual experiences simply cannot. A tattoo ritual, performed by a specialist, witnessed by a community, endured through real physical pain, wasn't just body art, it was social infrastructure. It bonded the tattooed person more tightly to their group, marked a transition that everyone present would remember, and created a permanent physical record that the transition had actually happened. Now here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If tattoos required so much pain, skill, and risk, why didn't ancient humans just stop doing it once they'd started? Why does this practice keep getting reinvented, culture after culture, completely independently, across tens of thousands of years? Because the human brain is, in a very real biological sense, obsessed with marking significant moments permanently. We are a species defined by our drive to record things. We painted on cave walls 40,000 years ago. We carved symbols into bone and stone. We built monuments that have outlasted the civilizations that built them by thousands of years. Tattooing the human body is simply this same fundamental drive applied directly to the most personal canvas available, yourself. There's also a darker, more practical layer to ancient tattooing that doesn't get talked about enough. In several ancient cultures, including parts of ancient Rome and ancient China, tattoos were used as a form of punishment or control. Slaves, criminals, and prisoners were sometimes forcibly tattooed with marks identifying their status, making escape or reintegration into normal society significantly harder. The same technology that ancient Polynesians used to proudly broadcast identity and achievement, other cultures weaponized to permanently brand people against their will. This is an uncomfortable but important part of the story. The exact same tool, a needle and pigment under the skin, can be used to honor someone or to permanently punish them, depending entirely on who's holding the needle and why. Permanence cuts both ways. It immortalizes pride, and it immortalizes shame with equal, unforgiving efficiency. Here's something that took modern science decades to even attempt, let alone solve. How do you actually study a 5,000-year-old tattoo technique and try to figure out how far back the method itself goes, when the only evidence is mummified skin you absolutely cannot cut open or damage? For most of the 20th century, the answer was, you basically guess. Researchers looked at otzi's marks and assumed they'd been made the way many traditional cultures still practice tattooing, by cutting the skin and rubbing pigment into the wound, similar to scarification. It was a reasonable assumption based on observed practices elsewhere. It also turned out to be wrong. In 2017, a team of researchers used high-resolution photography under specific lighting conditions to re-examine otzi's tattoos without touching his preserved skin at all. What they found surprised everyone. The marks weren't made by cutting, they were made by puncturing the skin repeatedly with a fine point, almost certainly something like a sharpened bone or thorn, then rubbing charcoal-based pigment into the puncture wounds. This is, mechanically, astonishingly close to how modern hand-poke tattooing works today, a technique still used by traditional tattoo artists and increasingly by hipster tattoo studios that will charge you considerably more money to do, slightly less precisely, what a Copper Age farmer figured out on his own with a sharpened stick. Even more remarkable, researchers studying the chemical composition of the pigment found it was made primarily from soot, essentially fireplace residue, mixed with what was likely some kind of fat or plant binder to help it adhere to the skin and resist fading over a lifetime. Otzi, or whoever tattooed him, had functionally invented a stable, long-lasting tattoo ink formula using nothing but the byproducts of his own campfire. No laboratory, no chemistry degree, just thousands of years of trial and error condensed into one specific, working recipe, passed down well enough that it ended up permanently embedded in the skin of a man who then died completely by accident, got frozen, and accidentally preserved the evidence for future scientists to find 5,000 years later. There's something almost unbearably human about that detail. The same fire that kept him warm at night, that cooked his food, that kept predators at bay in the dark, also produced the raw material he used to permanently mark his own pain relief points on his skin. Fire wasn't just survival technology. It was, among everything else it gave us, also our first tattoo ink, and quite possibly the reason tattooing could even start in the first place. And it's worth asking why tattoos specifically? Why not just body paint? Why not just clothing or jewelry, things that are far less painful and far less permanent to produce? Ancient humans had access to all of these options simultaneously, and they used all of them. But none of those other methods carried the same weight, because none of them carried the same cost. A necklace can be stolen. A painted symbol washes off in the rain. A specific style of clothing can be copied by anyone with access to the same materials. But a tattoo requires the bearer to have actually undergone the process, to have actually endured the pain, to have actually had access to a skilled practitioner willing to mark them. In small ancient communities where everyone generally knew everyone else's business, a tattoo wasn't just a symbol. It was a verified, witnessed, undeniable record of a specific event having actually happened to a specific person. You couldn't buy your way into having one without going through the same process as everyone else who had one. This is, in a strange way, the exact same psychological mechanism that makes modern credentials valuable. A university degree means something, at least in theory, because you can't simply claim to have one. You have to have actually gone through years of demonstrable work to earn it. A black belt in a martial art means something because you can't fake the years of training behind it. Ancient tattoos worked on precisely the same logic, just inscribed directly onto the body instead of printed on a piece of paper or sewn onto a belt. So let's bring this back to now. Tattoos today are, depending on who you ask, either completely mainstream or still slightly taboo, often both at the same time in the same room. Roughly a third of adults in many Western countries have at least one. Entire industries exist around removing them when people change their minds, which itself says something fascinating about the modern relationship with permanence. We want the meaning of permanence without necessarily wanting to live with the permanence itself forever, which is a very modern, very contradictory thing to want. But strip away the laser removal clinics and the regret memes and the slightly judgmental aunt at Thanksgiving, and you'll find the exact same impulse that drove a man in the Alps to mark his joints for pain relief over 5,000 years ago. The exact same impulse that drove Egyptian priests to ink protective symbols onto their arms. The exact same impulse that drove Maori warriors to endure hours of pain to permanently record their identity and status for everyone who would ever look at them again. We are still, after all this time, looking for ways to make the temporary permanent, to take a moment, a belief, a loss, a love, a fear we survived, and pin it to our own skin so it can never quietly fade the way memory does, so it can never be denied, never be lost, never be just a story someone could choose not to believe. Otzi never got to explain his tattoos to anyone. He died alone in the mountains, frozen mid-journey, and didn't speak again for over 5,000 years. But his skin spoke anyway. It told scientists exactly where his joints hurt, exactly what he tried to do about it, and exactly how far back this very particular, very strange, very human behavior actually goes. Far enough back that we still, after 30 years of study, don't actually know the real beginning. We just know it's older than anyone thought. Next time you see a tattoo, on a stranger, on a friend, on your own arm in the mirror, you're not looking at something trendy or new. You're looking at one of the oldest continuous threads in the entire human story. A frozen man in the Alps, dead before the pyramids were finished, already understood something we're apparently still figuring out. Some things are too important to leave temporary.